So again, thanks again for joining, and happy to walk through and share with you what we've been doing and what we're learning. Okay, so in a minute here, we're gonna kind of dive into running virtual design sprints. I am gonna do a very quick, really brief crash course on the design sprint itself. I noticed that a good portion of you already have an understanding of it, so I'm not gonna spend a lot of time on it, only because it looks like most people are familiar with sprints and we want to kind of get into the virtual aspect of it. But just to give you a really quick, like 2-minute crash course. So a design sprint is a 5-phased process using design thinking to really help kind of uncover insights, generate some ideas, test solutions, and get feedback from real people. It was really popularized by Google Ventures. So Jake Knapp and John Zeratsky, who wrote a book and published it in 2016 called Sprint. And it was about how they were actually testing this process with over 150 startups and new ventures to take an idea and basically test that idea with real people in market and then make some adjustments based on what they're learning. So are we going to pivot? Are we going to persevere with this idea? Are we going to pull the plug, for example? So it's a lot of the stuff that we really do in lean startup when we're running experiments, or in design thinking when we're looking to kind of uncover insights, test a prototype, for example. And even agile teams and scrum teams as well do it when they're testing some working software and getting that feedback to understand if they need to make any adjustments. So that kind of empirical process framework that all of us love is taking the best of agile teams, taking the best of design thinking and lean startup, and kind of mixing it into a recipe that you can run within 5 days. They're really good for if you've got to come up with some ideas, or if you've got to test an idea, if you're maybe kicking off a project, or if your team is stuck in trying to figure out a way to look at how they can actually move forward, then they can be a very powerful technique. Obviously, they're really good for getting real data from real people in terms of the direction that you're going into as a team. In terms of the process, it's a bit more prescriptive in the sense that it gives you exactly, here's the recipe, here's some activities that you can facilitate, workshopping activities that you can facilitate across the 5 days. So day 1, you are really trying to understand what is the challenge. You use a number of visualization tools to really understand that. Figure out where you want to go in terms of what's the long-term goal, how are we going to measure success, what are some key questions that we want to answer in the sprint so that we can actually reduce some of the risk and get some clean yes or no answers to the direction that we're taking. We typically bring in some people that have a good understanding of our end users. Maybe they've done some user research, or there's some subject matter experts. Again, we try and visualize overall what is the challenge, across a user's journey, for example, pick a target. So the whole point of day 1 is really just to use a lot of visualization to understand the challenge and the problem. Day 2, we start jumping into some solutions, and we start off with getting some inspiration. So looking across multiple applications, different industries, for example, how are they solving related problems? So we call that lightning demos, where everybody gets an opportunity to showcase something that they like. It could be about a particular feature that also is solving a similar challenge, coming from maybe a different app or a different product, for example, or service. And then afterwards, we actually look at trying to leverage individuals and the creativity and power of creativity from individuals across everybody together. So we're not relying on just, the one genius or the one brilliant person, for example. We're actually tapping the creativity from everybody. So we do that through a facilitated, ideation session, and there's a number of different kind of activities that are run there to kind of warm up people so that we push beyond that initial idea and actually get a lot of different ideas that we can then mix together to really provide a good solution. Day 3 is all about looking at making decisions. So now we're exploring all the different solutions, and we're kind of highlighting what we like about each one. We go through a bit of a speed critique to kind of pick out the points that we think are most relevant. And then afterwards, we make some sticky decisions. So we look at, okay, well, which one is the one that we really want to move forward, build a prototype, and actually start testing with real people. Once we've made that decision, we build a storyboard. And that storyboard is really a plan on what it's going to take to build the prototype. So on day 4, we actually start building a prototype, and we're looking at, something that's realistic, so high fidelity or a facade that can actually get the best reactions out of people when we put it in front of them, to test our assumptions or to test our hypothesis or some of the hunches that we were making around the solution. Day 5, we recruit people and bring them in, so real users, to get then their perspective and look at getting some clean yes or no answers to the questions that we had. Keeping track of all of that information, and then ultimately making a business decision around, do we persevere, do we pivot, or do we pull the plug? So all of that happens in a compressed format within 5 days. And when it's happening in person, it can be very powerful, these workshops. It starts to happen in a virtual setting, which is what we're going to be talking about in a minute here. So that was a crash course in design sprints. Obviously, it became quite popular. There's a number of different iterations on them. And it's not just Google Ventures. It also has come from the service design community. So it's come from a lot of different design communities in terms of taking some really great practices, putting them together in facilitated workshops to try and get the best insights and the best data and evidence to support decisions moving forward. So as I mentioned before, in person, you can move through a lot of these workshops quite quickly. Virtually, you could do the exact same. It's just going to take a little bit of effort to make sure that everything is in place beforehand. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move over to the virtual infographic here. And again, we'll share these infographics with everyone so that you guys have them and you can refer back to them and you can see them. So this last month, we've been pretty busy. We've been running a number of different remote sprints. And here's kind of like all of our learnings kind of boiled into one infographic. So maybe I'll get Leah, if you want to just talk a little bit about the benefits and challenges of when we're trying to do this work virtually, that would be great.
Yes, thank you again for joining us today. I'm a huge fan of design sprints personally, and one of the things that I love the most about them, whether remote or in person, is that for me, they always provided this tangible, structured process where I could apply some of the diverge, emerge, converge cadence of design thinking, which is sometimes a little bit challenging for organizations to figure out how to bring that in. So for me, that was sort of the thing that caught my eye initially. And that notion that Carlos mentioned about the ability to provide some strategic clarity on next steps is really critical. And we see that with our clients all the time when we run design sprints. The fact that they bring clarity to some of those unknowns, they essentially are de-risking big projects. And so for me, those are the two things that really stand out. In terms of the virtual sprints, some of the obvious benefits are what we are seeing tonight. So we have a whole distribution of people all over the province and beyond. Welcome to our Barcelonian. So there's no real spatial limitations. Of course, there are some time zone challenges if you're working with people across time zones, and that's, a relatively challenging feat to take care of, but it's not impossible. So that's definitely the first benefit of virtual sprints. The second one is the digital element of it facilitates an ease and a speed and even some anonymity that isn't possible necessarily in an in-person sprint. So when you're doing the voting activities, whether you're using Mural or Miro or any of the other types of platforms, there's typically an anonymous voting function, which we really love, but you can also, if you like to do the more visual map voting, you can also do that. So that's one thing. The content focus leads to a little bit less distractions from that you would normally see in an in-person design sprint. So, you get a lot of chatting going on and so on in person, but when you have your group focused online, especially if you're using adequate spacing and time breaks and so on, the team is really focused on the content, and so you can really move through that with a lot of efficiency. The other piece that we really notice is a huge difference is the environmental impact. So in an in-person design sprint, you're using tons of paper and Post-its and so on. And so you are really creating actually a lot of waste. Obviously in a digital context, you're not using that same amount of paper. So you're not wasting it. The other thing we also notice is in terms of documentation, you can export these mural walls as PDFs, and so the documentation is paperless as well. Some of the challenges that we're noticing with virtual design sprints is time creep, and I know this is something that is a little bit, well, I won't say controversial, but there's sort of two sides to this out in the Google sphere. For us, we've definitely noticed that it's a little bit easier to have added minutes here and there. Everything takes a little bit longer. Everybody's got to find the right spot. Everybody's got to do all sorts of little things, and the minutes really add up. So, in our opinion, everything does take a little bit longer if we're honest, and so you really have to work that into your planning. The other thing is reliance on technology and platforms. So as we all know, that's both a benefit, but can really also be a big problem. For instance, we were running a design sprint the other week, and Mural was down for a couple hours. So, you really have to have some plan Bs and probably some plan Cs for the fact if your technology isn't working. You also have to add in some time, certainly before the sprint begins. You want to incorporate into your pre-sprint planning a walkthrough so that everybody's familiar with the technology, because that, if they're don't have some familiarity, that will add to your time. But you also should think about working in a little bit of tech check-ins throughout the day just to make sure that everybody's mic is working. You can see my video isn't working today. It was working earlier, so I'm not sure what's going on. So those sorts of things happen, and you have to be prepared for them, but also be able to roll with it. Perhaps the biggest challenge I would say to virtual design sprints is just the speed at which disengagement and energy drains can occur. And so you really have to be on top of that. One way that we make sure that we sort of do that is we always have two facilitators. One is usually the main content facilitator, much like what's happening today. And then our co-facilitator is not only taking care of some of the organizational and administrative elements of the sprint and, cleaning up the boards and whatnot, but really taking care of the energy and the engagement level of the people. You also want to make sure you have a lot of breaks. We typically go 60 to 90 minutes. We'll make sure that we have a break. If you go a little bit longer, you might want to have a little bit longer break. Typically at the end of each activity, you want to take at least a 5-minute, stand up for an energizer or something. But yeah, you really have to be on top of that, because staring at a screen all day is really energy draining for most people. And then the last thing is sort of related to that. The distraction level is significant. So, I did mention in the benefits, that can also be a challenge in-person sprints, but the distraction level in virtual sprints is a little bit different. Without the face-to-face, people are more inclined to sort of migrate to their smartphones. Dogs are barking, kids are popping up. For the parents out there who are, struggling to work and mind their children at the same time, deliveries are coming. Now, some of this is specific to, our COVID situation, but yeah, definitely the distraction level is key. And so again, that co-pilot, co-facilitator really should be taking care to make sure that, one participant hasn't sort of disappeared or whatever the case is. So that's sort of it. I mean, that's not an exhaustive list, but those are the top benefits and challenges that we're seeing.
Thanks, Leah. So Leah kind of mentioned that at a high level, those are the things that you want to look out for. So there's lots of benefits for sure. And in fact, once you practice and you get used to it, it can actually be very powerful to do it remotely, actually. Because of those benefits. So you just want to be aware of those challenges and then have plans in place to address those challenges. In terms of some key highlights, just before we show you some of the templates, a couple things to consider. So definitely the preparation is a lot more rigorous when you come to preparing for the sprint. So you want to make sure that your templates are good and all the content is ready. Any content that you can get beforehand as well, you can actually already pre-upload and put into the template, so that way you don't have to necessarily be wrestling with data or content while you're working through the sprint. In terms of the agenda and the schedule, so that's probably one of the biggest changes. So there's a lot of let's say in the industry, there has been a lot of trends around reducing the sprint. So actually, we went from the 5-day design sprint down to the 4-day design sprint, which was the design sprint 2.0 format that was popularized by AJ and Smart. And it's a very powerful format, and they have some really great tools and techniques in that format. But what we're finding, because again, the energy drain and the disengagement and also just the challenge of, let's say, spending 8 hours in front of a computer collaborating intensely, that in fact actually splitting that across a couple of days is better, and you get actually better quality and better results. So what we have here is we've got something that actually spans 7 days. And so the idea here is that you would actually be doing maybe 3 to 4 hours a day, but then also leveraging some offline time. So instead of everybody being in the same room together, collaborating for a full day, you'll collaborate for, let's say, 3 to 4 hours, and then afterwards you'll have some homework or you'll have some offline time, and then you can actually spread that across a few more days as well. So it's not as intense, but still gets you the same, outcomes and the same great aspects of sprints in the same way. So one thing to do is definitely on day one is just make sure, again, like Leah mentioned, everybody has a chance to really get briefed on the sprint, as well as the technology and the tools, the templates, so that they're familiar. So if you're using Mural or Miro, that everybody has a chance to play around with it, get familiar with it, and you can kind of iron out those kinks within 90 minutes. So 60 to 90 minutes, and that's kind of out of the way. And then people also know what to expect with respect to the sprint and the agenda and the schedule. And then officially, with respect to day one being understanding the challenge, so in this case, you'd still run the same activities. Nothing's really changing there. And in fact, that first day is still pretty intense. So you still have a lot of activities that you're doing together. But then in day two, when you're ideating on some solutions, this is where you actually give some people kind of that offline time. So before in the sprint, you would actually do all of your ideation and solutions together within the room with everybody. In this case, you can do some of the warm-up activities in terms of getting them to start thinking beyond their initial ideas, getting them to do some visualization, but then afterwards give them their own alone time, offline, that they can actually create their solutions, their ideas, and then simply take photos and upload them into Mural or send them to the facilitator, for example, to upload them. So they can do that on their own. And the nice thing about that is that they can actually find the time that works for them within that day. Now you still time box it, so you're still saying, okay, within the remainder of the day, find the time to do your ideation and to do your solutioning, and then in the next day in the morning, they'll actually have an opportunity to go through and vote on those solutions. So it's blending this kind of offline and online time that allows them to kind of build in that energy and while still sticking to the commitment and the spirit of the sprint. Because the nice thing about the sprint is that it does make use of a lot of individual creativity and individual time. So that's one kind of benefit that you can do with this kind of offline-online blend. The other pieces, so things like the voting and the storyboard, those things are still happening online and they're still happening together. The prototyping is happening online. The user testing and interviews are happening online. So it's, those pieces are still interactive and still online. So give some thought to the schedule and be flexible on the schedule, and then really be creative in terms of blending that online and offline time just to maximize the creativity, but also the energy. The tools is definitely a key aspect of it. So you need something that's going to be a visual collaboration board. Mural is the most popular one that we've seen a lot of teams use recently. Miro is another popular one. But like Leah mentioned, you might need to have some backup plans in case those, if those tools are a problem, for example. So you might have to have a plan B, some templates ready in, let's say, Microsoft PowerPoint, for example, if you're using Office 365, or Google Docs. We've done one with Google Docs and it worked really well. where you can still kind of simulate the voting and the visual collaboration. You do want to have a place where you can store all of your documentation, so whether that's in Microsoft Teams or Slack, so any kind of passive communication and collaboration should be happening, and everybody should be clear on what that central location is where you have all of the artifacts and all of your information. And then of course, using a platform for video conferencing and chat is super important. So whether it's Microsoft Teams or Zoom, for example, can be quite powerful. The ability to record all of the interviews, whether they're the user test interviews or the subject matter expert interviews. You want to make sure that, with permission, of course, that you can record those for note-taking. Again, as much as possible, try and do a dry run, make sure that you've used and kind of gone through the tools and make sure that everything is working as you need it so that it becomes a lot easier when you're facilitating. The prototyping, the recruiting, a lot of teams are actually using remote user testing these days. So as a de facto approach anyway. That's a bit more convenient for teams that are already kind of used to doing remote testing. And then the prototyping tools have definitely improved quite a bit in terms of having everybody be able to collaborate at the same time, again, remotely. Figma is a really popular one that we see a lot of teams use. But again, as long as you have a tool that everybody can connect to and can share that space together and that you can actually link out to get some feedback on, that's the most important thing. Okay, so we're going to keep moving. So let's take a look at some of the templates. When we're talking about getting everybody prepared, so when you have that first session with your team, so obviously, one thing is to meet with the decider ahead of time. And again, just to be clear on what the goal is for the sprint, what the expectations are, what are some of the deliverables. But then when you're meeting with the team for the first time, you want to have a dashboard where you'll have the ability to show the agenda. They can actually click on any specific template for the day that they're going to be working from. But they also have like a fun activity that preps them for the technology. So Mural actually has some free templates that you guys can use. The dashboard was actually one of the templates that we actually found quite helpful, and so we customized it slightly just to kind of fit this agenda, which was a little bit more elongated, just to maximize some of the energy, and obviously update some of the templates that we created. But otherwise, we found that their dashboard template was actually quite helpful. And so they have like a fun activity where people can actually, get familiar with the technology by going in, uploading a photo of who they are, maybe their role in the organization, upload a picture of how they feel about the sprint, for example. The nice thing about doing that is that it gets them ready to do some of the things that we're going to be doing. So uploading is obviously important, especially when they're uploading, let's say, images of their solution, for example, when they're doing some of that offline work. So some of these fun activities gets them kind of primed up for some of the techniques that we need to get them to do, a little bit later on in the sprint, but we can also iron out any of their technical challenges. Obviously with Mural, you want to be able to teach them how to zoom in and out of a canvas. So using the mini map down at the bottom, zooming in and out, for example, some of the shortcut keys on how to, zoom and show some of the post-it notes, for example. So you want to get them as comfortable with the tool and the technology as much as possible. And then remind everybody what the schedule is going to be in terms of the agenda, what the purpose of the day is, how much time they need to allocate and expect for that particular agenda, as well as the ability to kind of dive into any of the days to actually show them, here's what we're going to be doing on let's say day one or session one. Here's what we're going to be doing on day two and session two, for example, so that they actually get kind of familiar to be able to navigate around the dashboard. The dashboard is kind of like home base. So at any point in time, they can come back to home base. It's nice at the end of each day or at the end of each session to be able to do a quick retrospective on, okay, what worked well, what didn't work so well, what questions do they still have, so that you can continuously, inspect and adapt on your facilitation and on your workshop. So definitely making sure that you're saving some time in the agenda for that is really critical. But having a dashboard or some kind of home base where everybody can go to that you can kick off each day, and then also they can kind of play around like a playground is quite helpful. Let's show you the dashboard. So the dashboard, you want to be able to show the agenda. You want to have an area that you do daily retrospectives, and also a fun kind of activity where everybody can get to know one another, and also you can test some of their techniques in terms of things that you need them to do later on in the sprint by doing things like uploading a photo of themselves, adding content with sticky notes, for example. So something that you can test on kind of day one to make sure that they're ready to go for the sprint. If you look at a specific day, so I mentioned how, the day that you're looking at understanding the challenge is one of the most intensive ones because there's so many activities. This would be traditionally day one of a design sprint. So before, we used to have our template all in one canvas in Mural. So I'll double click on just the one about understanding the challenge. So hopefully you can see this here in a second. But one thing to keep in mind is, so originally we had all of our activities in a really long mural, in a big mural, and you got to be careful because the thing that we found was that as more people started coming in and collaborating, and we had lots of different activities that we were facilitating, things got really, really, really slow, and we're not quite sure if that was just Mural having a bad week or a bad day, but it was unbearable. So we thought, okay, you know what, let's actually break out a lot of these activities and at the very least create a canvas just for the day. So that would reduce the number of activities, which was actually helpful for participants to be able to navigate around. The outline is pretty powerful in terms of helping people to focus on what activity we're going to be running. So for example, you can see that day one has 10 different elements within the outline on the right-hand side here. So we'd say, okay, everybody, right now we're going to focus on the long-term goal. So, click on long-term goal, and then that would zoom into a specific frame just for this activity. The other way you can do this in Mural that's quite powerful and helpful is by using the summon everyone feature. So if people are confused, if they're going to different places in the canvas, at any point in time as a facilitator, you can click on summon everyone and it'll refocus everybody to what you're looking at. So in this case, we want everybody to come to this portion of the canvas so that we can actually facilitate and run the activity. So between the outline and the summon everyone, these two features as a facilitator is really powerful to get people to focus. And this will help you run the sprint much faster and much easier. The other thing is just making sure that the instructions for each activity are clear on exactly what they need to do step by step is also super important. Because sometimes not everybody's listening, and then the visual aspect, the reading really helps. So we make sure that the purpose of the frame, like the activity that we're going to do, the instructions on how we're going to run that activity are listed, the timeline in terms of what they can expect. As you know, design sprints make use of the note and vote technique. So individual, quiet time, everybody kind of notes down some ideas. Then we post them up, then we vote on them, and then we pick one and we move on. And so getting through that kind of cadence for each of the activities is really powerful and helpful, but just making sure that that's outlined in the frame so that everybody's clear on how to do that. So in this case, we're doing the long-term goal. So if we're successful with the sprint, what will we achieve? What does the world look like 2 years from now? We also kind of gave everybody their own post-it notes. Having that level of consistency is helpful as you're going from frame to frame, so from activity to activity. It really helps them with that consistency and that reliability in the experience. So I know if I'm always purple, I'll be purple in all of the different activities. It reduces some of that friction with the technology and some of that confusion. So making sure all of the frames, have post-it notes ready, color coded, people getting kind of familiar with their post-it notes. And then the other thing too is you could use the voting mechanism that comes with Mural, which is really nice, especially to remove bias and reduce that groupthink, where Mural will actually hide the voting until you unlock it. Or you can just manually kind of create the voting circles and then place them up there, and people can kind of drag, so a little bit more of an analog feel. In either case, both works really well. There's obviously pros and cons to both. My preference right now these days seems to be more of the analog approach. A lot of people still have a lot of anonymity with the post-it notes and the voting. We do remind people, like, just remember that you're voting for what you believe to be, most relevant or most interesting, for example, so just try and reduce that groupthink. But I recommend playing with both. As the team members get more familiar with the technology, then you can kind of introduce new features of the technology, like, and then that kind of starts to reduce a little bit of the friction, and you know, you can do a bit more advanced stuff. But if you have to, you can still use some of those kind of analog ways that we would do it in the room. What else? Always make sure that when you've created your template that you lock all of the elements. So when you right click on an element, Mural will give you an option to lock. You want to lock everything except obviously for the content, like the post-it notes that people are going to be moving around. And the reason is otherwise, you know, sometimes people pick up, you know, maybe a set of instructions and they move it off your canvas and things get confusing. So make sure you create the templates, you lock in all the elements, and then only give the pieces that you want moved around to be unlocked. So that's kind of a key piece in setting up the room. But otherwise, you know, having all of the activities for the day and in the outline so that you can easily move from frame to frame. So, you know, success metrics, sprint questions, the interview process, you know, generating how might we statements to frame problems. Having these all ready to go is super critical and will save you lots of pain and headache as you're facilitating the sprint, and will make things a lot smoother for your sprintees as well as they're working through. I do find some of these more challenging activities that are in the design sprint, so things like creating a map, like a user journey map, can be a challenging one to facilitate. And also the storyboard can also be challenging because it creates a lot of circular discussions with the sprintees. I do find some of the faster, kind of more modern techniques of running those activities. So there's a couple of blog posts, and we can share those blog posts, but the map and the note and map, I believe, I can't remember what it's called right now, but the technique where you give people some quiet time to come up with their own map first, and then get everybody to vote on it, remove the pieces that are not relevant, for example, that would go a lot it does go a lot faster, and it's a lot smoother. And so I recommend running those when you're doing it virtually, just to really improve and save on time. So in terms of templates, definitely, you know, having one for each day. So at the beginning of the session or at the beginning of the day. The other thing you want to remember to do is also copy the data that's most relevant into the frame. And what I mean by that is, sorry, so if I go back here. So let's say we were on, you know, day 2 and actually looking at doing some ideation or some solutioning. So obviously when the team is solutioning, they need to be aware of, again, what the big problem is that they're trying to solve. And so you would have come up with that on the other canvas in day 1. So copying that data of, okay, so what's the long-term goal that we agreed upon? What are the key metrics? What are the top how might we's? The sprint questions. So all of the stuff that you did from day 1, having it as background data on the next day's canvas is really helpful. So then as they're working through some of the activities, they can easily just click on the outline to refer back to that data without necessarily having to jump to another canvas or to another mural. So just keeping that, like always really thinking about that experience for your sprintees and reducing as much friction as possible is super, super important. So things like even doing that, like just making sure that all the data that they need is in one canvas that they can easily refer to and see as they're working through the next activity. So maybe I'll pause there. Like obviously there's templates for each of the days and each of the sessions. And from the home screen or the dashboard, sorry, you can always get to each of the sessions and each of the templates. Just to make that navigation a little bit easier, just by double clicking on the templates, for example. But you can see that there's templates for each session or each day. Apart from day 1, which is pretty intense, and I'd say, you know, the prototyping is always a little bit, people, you know, are working really hard. They're pretty excited about it, but they, you know, that's another one that can be pretty intense. And then the interviews are really intense. So sitting, you know, at a computer, watching interviews, especially 5 interviews from real users or customers, for example, and then doing a retrospective at the end or a review of that data at the end is a long day. So just, give it some thought. If ideally you want to keep that retro and that review as close to the interviews as possible, but if it needs to go into the next day, for example, depending on the, how burnt out people are, then that's something to consider. So I'm gonna stop there because I think I gave you at least an understanding or a taste of some of the templates and some of the activities. If you have more questions, you can always feel free to reach out, send us an email. If you're really interested in getting your hands dirty or practicing a sprint, for example, we do have an upcoming virtual, like a 2-day workshop that we're doing. So reach out, send us an email if you're interested in that. We can share the details. And I just wanted to say thank you so much to everyone for joining us today.